Yes.
Sorry. Yes, perhaps we should have done that a little earlier, but it doesn't matter. Stephen, I will go back to introducing you again. We've said he's no stranger to Liverpool Hope. He was with us until last academic year. He is now the assistant professor at the Center for Trust, Peace and Social Relations at Coventry University. His research interests include mass atrocity prevention, the role of the UN in conceptualizing, carrying out prevention, the causes of genocide and mass atrocities, and the responsibility to protect the R2P. He is the author of The Structural Prevention of Mass Atrocities, published by Routledge, and Rethinking Humanitarian Interventions, which was published in 2018 by Palgrave with Alex Bellamy. So without further ado, Stephen, we are in your good hands.
Great. Well, thanks, Yazid, and it's great to come back to Hope. Well, if not physically, then virtually. And today I'm going to talk about managing religious diversity in Tanzania. But before I start that, I thought I'd just point out that today is Holocaust Memorial Day, and it's a day I suppose it's a day of serious reflection when we recall one of the worst atrocities that's ever been committed in history, and it's a time to actually think about really taking seriously the idea of never again. And of course, the more we say never again, the more we fail to prevent a number of atrocities and genocidal episodes that have happened over the last 70 years. And this often clouds us, I think, in seeing that amidst all of this failure, there are all sorts of interesting insights for managing risk associated with the worst kinds of violence. And the case I'm going to be looking at today, Tanzania, is an example of one of those cases that I think that can give us insights. That is, insights that actually provide some optimism on a day where we remember a very, very dark historical episode. And so I thought I thought it's quite pertinent to talk about Tanzania in that context. So this presentation is about how Tanzania has managed religious diversity, particularly focusing on its formative years of independence, the first 10 or 20 years of its independence. Demographically, Tanzania is a very diverse country. It consists of around 120 different language and tribal groups. And in terms of religion, the population is pretty much evenly divided between Muslims and Christians, making it demographically fairly similar in a lot of ways to Nigeria, a country which we know has experienced extensive conflicts and religious violence, particularly in recent years. Tanzania, by contrast, has not experienced religious violence. Apart from the smallest isolated outbreaks that are so small that they're not even really worth talking about, this raises the question of why is Tanzania different to a country like Nigeria? How has Tanzania managed this diversity much more successfully, and what can we learn from that? But to understand how Tanzania has managed religious diversity, we need to take a step back and ask a broader question. And that is, why is it that Tanzania has avoided violent conflict and mass atrocities, while other countries around it have been mired in intractable conflicts and mass violence? This is not a question that gets asked nearly as often as it should. Scholarship in terms of conflict and genocide studies is predominantly concerned with how and why bad things happen, not why they don't happen. So the question of why not is one which is largely overlooked. But this is the question that I start with. And it's by asking this broader question that we gain more clarity on the management of religious diversity in Tanzania. And so in this presentation, I'm going to focus on that broader question, while at the same time weaving the thread of religious diversity and its management through my answer. So the presentation has 4 parts. First, fairly briefly, I want to start with some conceptual framing. In particular, I want to talk about how we can approach asking a question about why and how something doesn't happen. This is something that political scientists don't really like to do. If you don't have an outcome at the end, then you can't construct a narrative about the causal paths towards something. So I'll talk about that briefly and why I think it's important. Secondly, I want to talk about Tanzania's background, its recent history, just to give you some context. Third, I'll talk about risk in relation to conflict and mass violence. In other words, what risk factors do we see in Tanzania? What challenges do we see in Tanzania, particularly early on in its independence? The fourth part, which is the real sort of meat in the sandwich, is where I explore the decisions, the strategies, the efforts, the different actors that have tried to mitigate this risk, tried to manage these challenges, and in the process, they've also found ways to manage diversity and to deepen social and political stability. Then I'll conclude by talking about some recent political developments in Tanzania, which I think are a bit of a cause for concern. And it's also a reminder that this question of managing diversity and mitigating risk is one which needs to constantly evolve in order to meet new challenges, particularly the challenges that Yazid referred to in the world today. So let's start off with a brief conceptual discussion. So I want to talk briefly about conceptually framing this question of why not. The question of why Tanzania didn't experience conflict and mass violence. This is one which I think has received very little oxygen, not just Tanzania, but any place. Asking that question of why not. People tend not to do that. But it's an important question because it gives us insights into what local and national actors are doing, which might be prohibitive in the face of risk in relation to violence. This influences then how we understand conflict prevention and how we understand mass atrocity prevention. Now, if we take the literature around conflict prevention, you see certain tendencies that pop up again and again. You see that there is a tendency to prioritize the role of international actors, even though local and national actors are clearly the key stakeholders when it comes to prevention in any given context. If we look at the literature around the causes of civil war, identity-based conflict, and also genocide and mass violence, you see a tendency. You see another tendency. You see a tendency there to focus on the question of why such violence happens. In other words, the priority and I guess the methodological tendency is to develop theoretical frameworks that give us an understanding of the causes of violent conflict and mass atrocities, which are all based on the selection of cases where such violence has happened. Now, that might seem absolutely logical. Well, of course, that's how you would develop theoretical frameworks around the causes of conflict and mass violence. But what this approach does is it overlooks why it is that some places that contain these causal factors or these risk factors avoid escalation into violence. If I could put this in another way, there have been theoretical claims about the causes of ethnic conflict, about the causes of genocide. You take a number of genocides, the Armenian genocide, Cambodia, Rwanda, the Holocaust, and then you look for common antecedents. You look for common causal factors. And from that, you can develop sort of theoretical sort of claims about the causes of genocide. What happens though in these theoretical framings is that the causes they identify tend to pop up in a whole range of different places where genocide doesn't actually happen at all. But the genocide scholarship and the scholarship on the causes of conflict in general tend not to look at those other non-cases to understand, well, we see these causes over there, but why is it that they're not actually escalating into violence? They tend to overlook that question, but that's the very question I'm interested in, because I think it's a very serious oversight in the literature. Now, there are two problems there. So in conflict prevention, we've got the tendency to focus predominantly on international actors as prevention actors. In the literature on the causes of conflict and mass violence, there's a tendency to overlook the question of why such violence does not happen. Now, these two problems, I think, are connected, because asking the question, why not, actually puts a spotlight on local and national actors in terms of prevention. So asking the question, why not, can actually teach us a whole lot more about prevention that we might not have known about previously. Now, this is where Tanzania, I think, becomes interesting. It has many potential fault lines and risk factors in its nearly 60-year history as an independent state. And these factors are associated with the possibility of conflict and mass violence. Yet these things haven't happened. And so we have to ask the question, why not? Now, one of those fault lines, I'll go into those risk factors and fault lines a little bit later, but one of them is the potential for interreligious violence. We need to get to the bottom of this and to understand why Tanzania is a little exceptional here. We need to ask that question, why not? Before we do that, let me just give you a little bit of background about the history of Tanzania. So this is a country in East Africa, south of Kenya, north of Mozambique, on the Indian Ocean coast. The territory that we call Tanzania today goes back to the origin of the human species. So I could talk about the history of this particular territory I could talk about it for days. But we know that the history of human habitation in Tanzania goes back probably a couple of 100,000 years. To truncate that, let me fast forward to the 20th century and look at, I suppose, its fairly recent colonial past and then its early independent past. So in the 20th century, Tanzania was first a German colony, and then after the First World War, it became a British colony. As a British colony, under the name of Tanganyika at the time, the African population was subject to widespread discrimination, as happened in a lot of colonial territories. They were denied property rights, they were not permitted to own and run businesses, and this inevitably provoked the liberation struggle which arose after the Second World War in the early 1950s. It really started to crystallize in 1954 when a young teacher by the name of Julius Nyerere formed a political organization called the Tanzanican African National Union, or TANU for short. I'm going to keep my acronyms to an absolute minimum, but there are a couple that you need to know. One is TANU, T-A-N-U. Now, TANU had branches throughout the territory of Tanganyika and attracted a very diverse membership, which reflected the demographics of the territory as a whole. Nyerere himself owed no political allegiance to any particular ethnic group. He came from a very small and obscure group way in the west of the country. But under his leadership, TANU engaged in a peaceful struggle for liberation and independence. In the process, it carved out a new and inclusive national identity, one which sought to accommodate all of the diversity of the territory. It also stressed that there would be no retribution for past injustice during the colonial era. Now, this is really important. This was a deeply pragmatic decision on Nyerere's past, and to understand it, we need to go back a little bit in history to an earlier liberation struggle under the Germans to understand why he chose this ostensibly non-violent approach. There was, in 1905, there was an uprising in German Tanzania called the Majimaji Uprisings, and they were violently crushed by the Germans. They were the extent of this violence is breathtaking. There were about 70,000 Tanzanians who were killed in putting down this uprising, and that was comparable to the genocide of the Hereros in another German territory in Southwest Africa that happened around the same time. That genocide against the Hereros in what's now known as Namibia is regarded as the first genocide of the 20th century. So when it comes to liberation struggles, Tanzania had a very painful memory. And Nyereri's conclusion was, well, we tried, a violent uprising in the past, and well, look what happened. Let's try something else. So anyway, that's what they did. Tanganyika gained its independence in 1961 with TANU forming government. They won every single seat in the new parliament, except one, which was an independent. And the independent declared allegiance to TANU anyway. So they basically gained every seat in the parliament. Now, in early 1964, it merged with newly independent Zanzibar, the archipelago just off the coast, and together they formed what was called the United Republic of Tanzania. So since independence, TANU's remained in power. In fact, it's still in power today, although it changed its name in 1977, and I promise you this is the last acronym. So it changed its name to the CCM, or Chama cha Mapinduzi, which is the Party of Revolution, but CCM is enough, that's all you need to know. I swear that's it, no more acronyms. So anyway, CCM is still in power today. In 1992, it lifted the prohibition on opposition parties. So ostensibly, it started a democratic transition, although that transition stalled. And in recent years, particularly in the last year, the CCM has become increasingly intolerant of opposition. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But that's also part of a trend that we're seeing in the world today of growing authoritarianism. So it's in part a cautionary tale that past successes don't always translate into future stability, and that we always need to be cautious, and we always need to be alert to challenges that arise, that are constantly, I suppose, coming at us from around the corner. So that's a little bit of background on Tanzania. Now I want to talk about risk. So I'm just going to go through and look at a few risk factors that are associated with identity-based conflict and also genocide and mass atrocities. So Tanzania, as you probably know, is one of the world's poorest countries. It really is a hell of a way to actually embark on the journey of independent statehood in a place where you have absolutely no resources and where there's absolutely almost zero capacity to develop the institutions and the functions of a modern centralized state. So from the outset, Tanzania was confronted with all sorts of profound challenges. It was faced with risk. I'll point out four main risk factors that arose in Tanzania from the outset. So first, and this still exists today, widespread poverty. The vast majority of the population in Tanzania live in poverty, and most people are undernourished. Tanzania's economy continues to be dependent on foreign aid, and there's widespread unemployment, particularly amongst the young. Second, there are the challenges around potential religious divisions. As I've mentioned, the roughly equal number of Muslims and Christians highlight the potential for religious-based violence. Now, this in and of itself is not an alarming factor, but what a lot of genocide scholars point out is that it is bipolar societies that pose the greatest risk for mass violence. So that in and of itself, I think, is worth looking at. Third, there is limited democracy and an increasing tendency towards authoritarianism. And then finally, it's in a violent neighborhood. This is a neighborhood that, since independence in the early 1960s has been characterized by civil war, mass violence, and genocide. Most of its neighbors at one time or another have experienced protracted conflict and mass violence, such as Uganda, Mozambique, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, and Kenya. This in and of itself, according to a lot of scholars, is a destabilizing factor. So the question now is, how does Tanzania manage all this risk, particularly when it's got extremely limited resources to come together and to construct a new state and to deal with all of these potential problems? The scale of these challenges is really difficult to put into words. They'd be difficult to confront in any country, but in a country that's newly independent with no resources whatsoever, that has been neglected by its previous colonial administrators, to actually construct a centralized modern democratic state from that with profoundly limited resources, this is virtually insurmountable. And many of these challenges still exist today. They haven't gone away. But unlike its neighbors, as I've mentioned, Tanzania hasn't endured war. They haven't experienced genocide or other atrocities. So how have they done this? How have they managed these challenges? What I'm going to do now in the time that we have left is to focus on how they've done this. But in particular, I want to talk about managing diversity, managing relations between different ethnic and tribal groups and different religious groups. So I'm going to focus on questions around social cohesion and how that was strengthened, particularly in the formative years of independence. So I'll start off by talking about ethnic diversity or intertribal diversity. So as I mentioned, well, first I'd say that because the country is so ethnically diverse, this is in itself a protective factor against identity-based conflict or mass atrocities. Of the 120 different tribal groups in the country, no single group dominates the landscape either politically or economically. Many tribal areas are sparsely populated, and even the notion of chieftainship in a lot of places is not widespread. But another thing happened in the late 1960s that fostered cohesion between these different groups. And I'll need to sidetrack just a little bit. So when Julius Nyerere became the first president of Tanzania in the 1960s, he had all sorts of grand visions about developing the country. And for that, he wanted to first develop it economically and build an industrial base. He had some grand visions about that. But to do that, he needed investment from the outside. He needed foreign investment, and no foreign investment was forthcoming. Nobody wanted to give Tanzania anything. So he thought, well, he needs to rethink this whole plan of state building. So in 1967, he released something called the Arusha Declaration. And he developed this idea called Ujamaa, which is a Kiswahili term. It basically means family. And the essence of Ujamaa was this idea of self-reliance and self-subsistence. We're going to build everything from the ground up, and we're going to start with villages. And we're going to start with developing local, rural, sort of commercial infrastructure, and then we'll move from there. It'll be slow, but it will be self-reliant. And so as part of this idea of Ujamaa, Nyerere initiated something called villagization. So a lot of people were living in sparsely populated rural areas, in farms, sort of not interacting too much with anybody else and mostly subsisting. And he moved people into larger communities, basically villages. This happened all throughout the rural population. Something like 85% of the rural population were relocated into villages from more sparsely populated rural settings. Now, what this did was it encouraged coexistence between different ethnic and religious groups. So this social engineering that was part of this vision of Ujamaa is something that actually kickstarted and fostered more interaction between different language groups around the country. In addition to this, it became standard practice for all secondary school students to travel away from their home region and to attend boarding school somewhere else. Likewise, with civil servants, they were commonly located in regions away from their homes. In short, ethnicity has never been used to mobilize any section of the population politically. Let's move on to religious cohesion. Now, as I mentioned, Tanzania's got roughly equal sort of numbers of Christians and Muslims. That gives it a demographic character similar to Nigeria. And as I've mentioned, bipolar societies can be said to be at greater risk of genocide and mass violence. Yet the religious differences in Tanzania have been managed relatively astutely since independence. A lot of scholars point out that Tanzania could easily be a torn country, given the mix of both poverty and religious difference. But it's far from this. One factor that contributes to this management is Tanzania's ban is prohibition on campaigning or forming political parties on the basis of either ethnicity or religion. These laws are the product of the character of Tanzania's liberation struggle when it established a culture of religious unity. This then became the foundation for national unity. And also, the villagization process that I talked about also brought together Christian and Muslim communities, and it compelled them to help each other build churches and mosques, as well as other community buildings. So it really fostered interaction and cooperation. One can also see an expression of this religious cohesion and unity at an elite level within the governing party of the CCM, which used to be TANU, just repeating those acronyms. The party, the CCM, or when it was TANU, when it was formed by Julius Nyerere, he was the first leader. Now, Nyerere is Christian, but since the establishment of this party, and since it has been in power, there have been 5 different presidents. And these different presidents would alternate between Christian and Muslim. So first you had Nyerere, then you had a Muslim president, followed by a Christian, followed by a Muslim, and then another Christian. And this was deliberate, and it's really important. And so what this shows is that even at an elite level, you see this very public gesture of power sharing between both Christians and Muslims, which I think was a prohibitive factor against the development of religious-based grievances that could easily have permeated, particularly in the first decade of independence. So that's a little bit on religious cohesion. Thirdly, I want to talk about language. In particular, the national language called Kiswahili. I think Kiswahili aided the processes of social cohesion and interreligious cooperation because it was already a pre-existing local lingua franca. At independence, Kiswahili was adopted as Tanzania's official language. And I think this helps foster national unity. Let me just explain. You probably know a little bit about this language, but I'll just add a couple of details. Kiswahili is a hybrid language. It's spoken through much of East Africa. It's a mixture of Arabic and indigenous African languages. Over time, the language spread inland to function as a means of communication through vast trade networks throughout the region. Kiswahili became a key instrument in managing religious and ethnic diversity in Tanzania. The language facilitated cross-ethnic communication in a distinctly African context, and it lessened linguistic dependence on the colonial language of English. This is really important because it prevented the emergence of an English-speaking elite of political patrons. It also prevented the exacerbation of divisions between Muslims and Christians because they're both being educated in the same language. So those who initially, in earlier times, received an education in English did so in schools run by Christian missions, which meant that prior to independence, Western education in the colonial language was a privilege that Christians predominantly enjoyed. Now, this was countered by the introduction of Swahili as the language of instruction and the nationalization of all mission schools upon independence. Thus, the inaugural or the first government's policy of promoting Kiswahili in this very socially diverse territory was just one of many policies that it adopted to manage difference and foster unities in ways that still have strong currency today. Finally, I want to say a few things about political stability. All of the policies and initiatives that I've mentioned so far, these are largely the product of an inclusive vision of a national identity that was embraced by TANU from the start. But in particular, it was something that was the brainchild of its leader and founder, Julius Nyerere. Nearly 6 decades of Tanzanian independence has certainly provoked a myriad of challenges to the country's stability. But I think it's instructive to reflect on the fact that despite all of these challenges, the widespread poverty, the protracted periods of economic decline, for example, that there have been no major political or social crises that have erupted in that time. Let me just give you a sense of what kind of foundation this inclusive identity gave. So Tanzania, like a lot of African countries, under duress, went through structural adjustment programs at the behest of the IMF. That is that in order to qualify for loans issued by the IMF, they had to agree to make certain political reforms that contracted government spending and liberalized economies that ostensibly were supposed to encourage commerce or investment. What happened was that it took away very flimsy safety nets that existed at the time and exacerbated inequality in very dangerous ways. It happened in Tanzania, it happened in other places. But the interesting thing in Tanzania was that even though inequality increased after these structural adjustment programs, those increased inequalities did not develop an ethnic or religious character. In other words, you don't see Christians becoming rich at the expense of Muslims or vice versa, or you don't see particular ethnic groups gaining advantage at the expense of other ethnic groups. What happens is this growing inequality doesn't have a horizontal character, or in other words, it doesn't have an ethnic or religious character. And I think this is because of the strong foundation of national unity that Julius Nyerere and the TANU government really insisted upon at the very start. To talk a little bit more about, well, okay. But just to bring us up to the present, I think Tanzania is at another crossroads. It's, as I mentioned, in the early 90s, it started a democratic transition. That stalled a long time ago, and now we see this creeping authoritarianism, which means that we might be at a point where this long stretch of political and social stability might be coming to an end. I'm not sure. It's a crucial point in the history of Tanzania, as it is in the history of a lot of countries right now. But I think it's really important to take stock of the positive impacts that Julius Nyerere's inclusive vision has had on the country. He was determined to ensure a level playing field from the start. And so I thought I might just add a couple of quotes from Nyerere himself to give you a flavor of what his vision was. This is during the independence struggle. He said that we are determined to see that those Africans and Europeans who have chosen to live permanently in Tanganyika shall enjoy the same political rights as everybody else. And in another point, he said, there is no divine right of Europeans, no divine right of Indians, no divine right of Africans either. We are all Tanganyikans, we are all East Africans. The race quarrel is a stupid quarrel, and it can be a very tragic quarrel. If we all make up our minds to live like ordinary sorts of fellows and not to think about not to think that we were specially designed by the Creator to be masters and others specially designed by the Creator to be hewers of wood and drawers of water. We will make East Africa a very happy country for everybody. That just gives you a sense, I suppose, of the kernel of this idea of national unity that Nyerere nursed and materialized during those formative years. So it was no small challenge to create this kind of national unity, national identity, I should say, virtually out of thin air, when none had existed before. That was the challenge of many former colonial territories like Tanzania. In constructing such an identity from scratch, Nyerere forged a new inclusive identity, not only in vision, but also in practice. And I think this is what we must look to first, to understand how and why a country with such profound economic limitations and challenges was able to go about the business of state building in an ostensibly peaceful way, and one which in particular, I think, was very successful at managing religious diversity. So just to conclude, I'll just say a few points just to recap. First of all, managing diversity, managing religious diversity in particular, in the case of Tanzania, was a product of policies and initiatives at both an elite level and a local level. At an elite level, there was a prohibition of parties along the lines of ethnic and religious identity. There's been an alternating of Christian and Muslim presidents since 1961, if you go back to Tanganyika's independence. At a local level, there has been cooperation through the villagization process, which created a strong foundation of interreligious interaction and dialogue through the building of helping each other build their churches, their mosques, and other community centers. Language was a huge advantage, and this was a natural advantage that Tanzania had that a lot of other countries don't. And finally, this unity doesn't happen on its own. In Tanzania's case, it was the product of the first leader's inclusive vision. This is something that he nursed and that he propagated and put into practice. But every era throws new challenges, and what worked in one decade might not work in another. Managing diversity and mitigating risk, these are long and fluid processes. The current challenge is growing authoritarianism. In Tanzania's recent election last year, there was a violent crackdown by the incumbent CCM government. Before and after the elections, there was an election in late October, and there was growing protests, and there was a growing sense that the CCM is conducting all sorts of irregularities to stay in power. But all of this leads to a growing intolerance of dissent in the country. So let's be cautious. Let's take stock of everything that Tanzania has achieved, but let's be sober about the challenges moving forward ahead. And I'll leave it there.
Stephen, thank you so much. There's a lot